My name is Alex, and this happened when I was 22. The summer after I graduated from college, everyone was taking big trips, Europe, Southeast Asia, but I wanted something different. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disappear for a bit. I found it on a site dedicated to off-grid rentals, a small weathered cabin deep in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. The listing was sparse: no Wi-Fi, no cell service, minimal electricity from a few solar panels. The nearest town, the owner mentioned in a curt email, was a 40-minute drive on an unpaved logging road. Perfect. The first few days were idyllic. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I read classic novels by the light of a kerosene lamp, hiked to a nearby unnamed waterfall, and slept a solid 9 hours every night. I felt the tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying drain out of me. The cabin itself was small, measuring approximately 400 square feet with a single room and a small loft for the bed. It felt sturdy, built in the 50s or 60s with thick wood walls and a stone hearth. The silence was the first thing to change. On the fourth night, I sat by the fire, writing in my journal. The usual symphony of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of wind in the canopy, the distant call of an owl was suddenly gone. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was an instant, absolute erasure of sound. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like a heavy blanket pressing against your eardrums. I looked up, pen frozen mid-stroke. I could hear the tiny crackle of the fire and the low, hollow thump of my own heart, and nothing else. I got up, crossed to the window, and peered out into the impenetrable blackness. I didn't see anything. No headlights, no movement, just the unnerving, absolute stillness of the woods. I told myself it was atmospheric pressure or some weird, localized weather phenomenon. I forced myself to go to the loft, and eventually I fell into a restless sleep. The silence broke just as suddenly about 3 hours later. I woke up with a gasp, not to a sound, but to the return of sound. A sudden, loud wash of forest noise that was almost overwhelming. The next morning, I shook it off. The woods can be weird, but the pattern established itself. Every evening, sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, the silence would fall, and it would always last for exactly 3 hours. I started anticipating it. I'd watch the clock. At 11:17 p.m. on the sixth night, the cricket stopped mid-chirp. The wind seemed to hold its breath. It was during these silent hours that I started noticing things about the cabin. Small things at first. The cabin had an old-fashioned, heavy wooden latch on the front door, the kind that had to be lifted and turned to open. One silent night, I watched the latch. I was sitting maybe 10 feet away, in a chair by the hearth, the fire low. I saw the brass latch lift. It didn't move much. Just a tiny, slow millimeter, the movement almost imperceptible. But it was there. My breath caught. I stared, heart hammering. It stayed lifted for a moment, then, with the faintest tick that should have been swallowed by the sound of the wind, but wasn't, it dropped back into place. I spent the rest of that silent interval holding a small, heavy piece of firewood, staring at the door. The next day, I bolted the door. Literally. I found some heavy screws and a sturdy piece of scrap wood in a small utility closet and jury-rigged a thick horizontal brace across the width of the door. Nothing short of a battering ram was getting through that. That night, 10:55 p.m., the silence fell. The 3-hour clock was ticking. I was in the loft. The rifle I'd brought for bare safety leaned against the wall next to the bed. I was terrified, but also determined. I was not going to run. I was going to see this through. I heard it from downstairs, the sound muffled by the floorboards. Scraping. Not the sudden shocking sound of an animal, but a slow, deliberate scrape of something hard and rough against the wood floor. It started near the hearth and moved slowly toward the kitchen area. I strained my ears. The silence outside was absolute. The sounds inside the cabin, the low murmur of the solar battery inverter, the faint squeak of the house settling, felt incredibly loud, and then the scraping. It stopped at the foot of the ladder leading up to the loft. I froze. I was pressed against the furthest wall, holding my breath, my knuckles white against the rifle stock. The cabin had a window in the loft, right next to the bed. It was small, maybe a foot wide, and too high for anyone to look in easily. Suddenly, I heard a sound directly outside that window. It was a wet, heavy, slow thump, like a bag of wet dirt being dropped onto the wooden sill. Then, a new sound, one that finally broke me, a slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the glass, not with a human finger. This sounded heavy, thick, and not entirely solid, like a bundle of old dead roots. It tapped 3 times, tap, tap, tap. Then the window began to slide open. The locking mechanism was a simple hook and eye, and it was pulling itself open slowly, with an awful protesting squeal of dry wood against wood. The tapping stopped. The silence of the forest outside was still total. As the gap widened, a smell drifted in. It wasn't the smell of pine or dirt or wood smoke. It was the smell of a stagnant swamp, of old moldy water, and something else. Something metallic like old blood. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the smell, by the sheer audacity of the slow, careful opening of the window. Through the widening gap, the absolute blackness of the night looked different. It looked heavier, thicker, like a velvet curtain just waiting to part. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressed the muzzle of the rifle to my chest, and let out a soundless scream. I stayed like that, heart trying to claw its way out of my ribs for what felt like an eternity. When I finally risked opening my eyes, the window was still open. The smell was still there, but the tapping had stopped. I looked at the clock on my phone, which I kept charged and on airplane mode. It was 1:55 a.m. The silence was over. Immediately, the forest rushed back in. The wind, the crickets, the rustling. It was a wave of sound, and it felt like salvation. I scrambled down the ladder, grabbed my keys, and didn't even look at the door with the heavy bolt. I ran straight out the back door, leaving it open behind me, and sprinted the 50 feet to my truck. I threw it in drive, tore down the logging road, and didn't slow down until I hit the paved highway 70 miles later. I never contacted the owner. I never called the police. I don't know what I would have told them. The truck, my keys, and my phone are all I have. I left the rifle, the journals, my wallet with all my cash and ID, and all my clothes in the cabin. That was a long time ago. I've started over taking a job hundreds of miles away, and I rent a small apartment with a dozen neighbors within shouting distance. But sometimes when I'm alone in my new secure room, I think about the Olympic National Forest. I think about the heavy, awful blanket of that 3-hour silence. And I wonder what was standing at the foot of the ladder, slowly scraping its way toward me. And I wonder if it eventually got bored with the cabin and decided to follow, because sometimes late at night, I'll be sitting in my new quiet apartment and I'll hear a sound. It's always very faint. It sounds exactly like a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap coming from the outside of my kitchen window. And I never look.
My name is Finn. This happened 3 years ago when I was living in rural Vermont, right near the New York border. I was staying in an old farmhouse that had been in my family for generations, surrounded by about 20 acres of patchy woods and fields. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and out there you learn to know the sounds of the night. You know the coyote's chorus, the frantic squeak of a field mouse, the low hoot of the great horned owl. They are comforting because they are normal. One summer the sounds changed. It started with the deer. We had a large open field that backed up to a thick pine forest, and every evening a group of maybe 8 or 10 deer would come out to graze. They were part of the scenery, beautiful and skittish. One evening, I was sitting on the back porch, drinking coffee and watching them. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows, and I noticed something strange. They weren't moving. They weren't grazing. They were simply standing there, perfectly still, their heads up, facing the tree line. Their tails were motionless. If you've ever watched deer, you know they are perpetually twitchy. They are always flicking an ear, shifting weight, chewing, or nervously glancing around. These deer were statues. I watched them for a good 5 minutes. Then one of the bucks, a magnificent animal with a 6-point rack, let out a sound. It wasn't a snort or a warning. It was a low, rattling sound, like dry leaves being dragged across pavement. A sound of absolute primal fear. Then they all started to run. But they didn't run into the woods, which is where they usually went for cover. They ran parallel to the woods, along the furthest edge of the field, moving together like a single brown wave. They ran until they hit the farthest stone wall, then they leaped it and disappeared into the neighbor's property. That was the last time I saw a deer on our land for over a month. I rationalized it. Maybe a bobcat or a black bear or maybe a loose dog had spooked them. I decided I was making too much of a natural occurrence. Then came the second thing, the silence. The nights started to go quiet. Not immediately, but gradually. Over the course of a week, the constant busy chatter of the forest just faded away. First, the crickets went. Then the owls stopped their calls. The coyotes, which usually howled like a pack of demons, vanished entirely. It was the most unnatural silence I have ever experienced. It was heavy, insulating, and completely wrong. It was the sound of everything holding its breath. I couldn't sleep. I'd walk the house, peering out the windows into a darkness that felt like thick velvet. On the 10th night of the silence, I was standing in the kitchen, looking out at the big open field. There was a full moon, so the field was bathed in an eerie silver light. And then I saw the animal. It wasn't a deer, it was too low, too broad, and it moved with a strange, deliberate rhythm. It was a dog, I thought at first. Maybe a very large, powerful hunting dog. It was in the very center of the field, and it was digging. Not furiously, like a dog after a mole, but slowly scooping the earth with its front paws, then tossing the dirt behind it. I crept to the back door, quietly unlocking the deadbolt and stepping out onto the porch. I needed a better look. The moment I was fully outside, the animal stopped. It went into that statue-still position I had seen the deer take. All motion ceased. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own pulse. I could see it clearly now in the moonlight. It was large, the size of a Great Dane, but its build was all wrong. Its body was too lean, almost skeletal, but its forelegs were monstrously thick. Its fur, where I could make it out, was black and matted with mud or something darker. And then it turned its head toward me. It was too far away for me to make out its features clearly, but the light hit its eyes and they flashed back at me. They weren't the amber or green or reflective blue of a normal animal. They were a dull, sickly white. Like the eyes of a fish that has been dead for a week. I stood there for what felt like an hour, trapped by those white eyes. It didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move any part of its body except for that slow, unnervingly focused turn of the head. Finally, I couldn't take the silence and the stare anymore. I let out a shaky, desperate shout. "Get out of here!" The sound was swallowed immediately by the quiet night. But the moment I yelled, the creature moved. It didn't run. It simply dropped its head, as if returning to its task, and continued digging. It was like I hadn't spoken at all. That was the moment the terror truly set in. It wasn't frightened of me. It didn't even acknowledge me. I backed slowly into the house, relocked the deadbolt, and stood with my back against the door, watching through the small pane of glass. It kept digging. and then it pulled something out of the hole. I couldn't tell what it was, a mess of earth and roots maybe, but it was heavy. The creature laid the object on the ground beside the hole, and then it did something truly bizarre. It started patting the dirt back into the hole with its nose. Slowly, gently, like it was tucking something in. When the hole was filled and the disturbed earth was smoothed over, it picked up the item it had pulled out. It looked like a heavy, dark length of rope, or maybe a thick piece of wet leather. And then, holding this mysterious object in its powerful jaws, the creature walked away. It walked directly into the pine woods, moving not quickly, but with a slow, powerful stride that seemed to melt effortlessly through the shadows. It disappeared, and the silence remained. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the empty field. The next morning, I walked out there. The sun was up, the field was normal, and yes, the comforting sounds of the forest were beginning to return. A single crow cawed in the distance. I found the spot where the creature had been. There was a patch of disturbed earth clearly visible. I got a shovel from the barn and started to dig. I dug down maybe 3 feet, expecting to find the remains of a small animal or maybe some old farming junk. But the only thing I found was a piece of white, brittle bone, maybe 3 inches long, that was too thick to be from a small rabbit. I tossed it aside and kept digging, and then I hit something hard. It wasn't a rock. It was a wooden chest, maybe 2 feet long. It was old, black with decay, and smelled strongly of iron and earth. It was nailed shut. I dragged it out and broke the rotten wood with the shovel. The chest was empty. Except for one thing, a neat, heavy braid of human hair. It was dark brown, almost black, and tied with a piece of brittle leather cord. It had clearly been cut, not pulled. I dropped the shovel. I didn't touch the braid. I simply stood there, staring at the empty hole in the full box. That night, I left. I packed a small bag and drove away, never looking back at the house or the field. I sent the key to my cousin and told him I'd moved back to the city. I never told anyone what I found, but sometimes when I'm out walking in a park or even crossing a street in the city, I'll see a dog. A large, black dog? And for a fraction of a second, I will see its eyes, not black or brown, but those dull, horrifying white eyes. And I know with a certainty that chills me to the bone that the animal wasn't digging to bury something. It was digging to retrieve something. And I wonder, what exactly did that creature take from that box that night? Was it simply a trophy? Or was it something that was once an owner? And when it walked into the woods, was it leaving, or was it simply starting its hunt again? Because the silence is still out there. And I keep seeing those white eyes, and I keep feeling like whatever was sleeping in that field is now wide awake,